Thank you, Rebecca, for being here. And Thuy Vu is a former refugee, but a brilliant journalist, anchor, and former reporter for KQED television in San Francisco, and a member of IWF Northern California. Welcome, Thuy. Their full bios are in the program. I would encourage you to read them because their accomplishments are too many for me to talk about here. I want to remind you that this is a town hall format, so we'd like to welcome your input and your questions throughout the hour. You'll see the 2 microphones at the aisles. So I want to start, and I'm going to start here in Canada with the Syrian sponsorship program. And Rebecca, you decided to get involved. Can you start by telling us a bit about the program and why you decided to get involved?
Right. Well, fortunately in Canada, we have not only government sponsorship of refugees, but it's rather easy to also get involved as a private citizen with a group of people to privately sponsor refugees. And when we were watching the news and seeing, suffering and desperation, it really hit into my social justice core. And a group of neighbors and friends decided to get together and sponsor 2 families of refugees from Syria.
What does that involve, sponsorship?
Yeah, well, a lot. It starts with sort of basic settlement responsibilities. You're responsible for financial needs and housing and education, health, as well as things like transportation. Also for connecting people to services, that might be banking or hospitals and so forth. Providing some informal social connections within the sponsorship group, but also more broadly in the community. And also, being available to listen and to help navigate bureaucracy and cultural differences. And more, but it's a significant relationship to help people who have been, traumatized and are coming to a very new, very unfamiliar place, and looking to find a new way to try to make that home despite the difficulties.
Tell me about your families, because we know that Canada really took in the ones who were most in need.
Yes, well, yes, Canada was focused on very vulnerable populations and populations that might have difficulty getting other places. And so my sponsorship group, we thought we were very well prepared. We had people who were involved in immigration support. I have a specialty in diversity and inclusion. We had a medical doctor and many other people on the team that thought that we'd be really good at supporting anyone who might have a disability and anyone who might be part of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual population. And we ended up getting one family who did have a member with a lot of disabilities related to shrapnel and injuries from being bombed, but injuries that weren't treated appropriately. And then also a single man who's gay. So we were able to, have a really close connection with some of the most vulnerable populations there.
Thuy, you were on the receiving end of some of this many years ago. Can you talk about the challenges refugees face when they come to a new country?
So if I can backtrack a little bit, my family came here in 1975. Louder? What about now? Okay. That's funny because volume has never been my problem. So my family immigrated to the U.S. at the end of the Vietnam War in 1975. There were 11 of us. I'm one of 8 kids. And with the chaos on April 30th, 1975, we actually had to split up. So half of us went by plane and half of us went by boat. So my mom and some of my siblings went by plane, and then she had to decide which ones of us would go by boat and risk our lives at sea. And so I was one of the ones that she decided would go by boat. And so so we languished at sea for a while. I'm not going to go too deep into the story. It takes up too much time. But we ended up in Guam, and then the other half of my family had ended up at a different refugee camp in Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. And so we were all reunited in Arkansas. And from there, we were sponsored by a Lutheran church group in Duluth, Minnesota. So that was my first official home in the United States. I went from Saigon, Vietnam, to Duluth, Minnesota. Wow. So, and I'm here in Toronto thinking, this looks a little like Duluth. This looks familiar. And, you know, we could not have survived without the graciousness and generosity and kindness of people like Rebecca. Really, we came here with nothing except the clothes on our backs. The church that sponsored us had to provide everything. I mean, really think about that. 11 sets of winter boots, 11 coats, 11 forks, 11 spoons, 11 knives, 11 bowls, 11 plates. We had nothing. And we lived in a little house that was right next to the Lutheran church where their staff lived on the bottom floor and all of us were jammed in on the second floor. But, you know, to us it was heaven compared to what we had been through. And I think, you know, the difficulties of arriving in a new country after having languished at sea, after having been on a boat, after not having enough to eat, after, you know, going to Singapore and being turned away by people there and saying, we don't want you refugees here on our shores. Here's some fuel, here's some rice, go on your way. After you experience that, you arrive in the shores of a new country pretty already well traumatized. I mean, not only are you you're without a country, so you've lost everything, you've lost your country, you've kind of lost your identity, you don't speak the language, you have no money, you have no job skills that are really applicable to your new host country. Like my mom sold goods on the market in Saigon, Vietnam, dealing with, in Vietnamese currency, dong. That's not really going to help her in the US, not knowing the language or trying to sell things. At the markets in the U.S. My dad owned a bus that we leased out to other groups that needed a bus for tours, and you know that's not something that he can do in the U.S. without language skills and not having money to buy a bus. So it was basically starting over, and I'm so grateful now that we arrived in a country where there was a program in place for private sponsorships, but my heart breaks when I think about the refugees now who are landing in countries without any programs like that. They really are in limbo. I mean, there's no formalized system to help them. And I think the difference between when I immigrated and what we're seeing around the world now is that, you know, it used to be humanitarian aid was designed for the basic needs, food, water, shelter, healthcare. But that was with the understanding that the refugees would be able to go home relatively quickly. And the way that society has evolved now and global conflicts have evolved is that they're lasting for longer. They're lasting for decades in many cases. And a lot of the refugees are staying in camps or staying outside of camps in really horrible urban neighborhoods where there is no support structure. And they're staying in those places 10, 15, 20 years. Their children are growing up in those environments. And so not only do you have the current generation facing all this trauma and all these hardships, their children are also being raised amid all that. So then you have to think, what do we do about them? What's their future? And I think that that's really the other dilemma here, not just what we're currently facing, but what we're facing in the future with the generation of kids, of refugees who are growing up like this for 10, 15, 20 years.
That's a good jumping off point to ask you, Reem. You were dealing with this in Jordan.
Yes. As a country, Jordan is considered to have the second highest number of refugees per capita in the world. 1/3 of the population of Jordan are refugees. Our population is 10 million. 1/3 are refugees. We have 57 nationalities for refugees. And we have 2 million Palestinians. We have 700,000 Syrians, Iraqis, Sudanese, from Somalia, from Yemen, and from other countries, including even Kuwait. So, there was no decision whether to allow the Syrians to come in or no. Jordan has always been a safe haven in a very turbulent region. And so the idea was, how do we accommodate those Syrians coming in the country? At the beginning, we would have like 1,500 come per night, and the Jordanian army would receive them at the borderline. And I remember pictures of children who, when they saw a man in a military clothing, they would be frightened, because for them, what they used to see in Syria is that someone in a military clothing is there to terrorize them. But then our army would pick them up and take them in buses into camps. And then we realized early on that in Jordan, they cannot stay in camps. They needed to be in what we call the hosting communities. And so now, even with the Zaatari camp being known as like this camp where it's recognized all over the world for refugees, less than 10% of Syrian refugees live in the camp.
And it's a huge camp.
It's a huge camp, but 90% live in hosting community. And we realized also early on that you cannot keep them segregated. They needed to be part of the community and to enrich, because Syrians are a very educated, craftsmen, and they're able to contribute to to society. So what we did as a country was actually, first of all, the country exercised its authority, where we had to make sure that every Syrian is recognized through using the process of the iris. And then actually knowing where their place of residency is around the kingdom, and issuing 200,000 work permits for Syrians to work. I'm saying all this, and Jordan is not a signatory to the Geneva Convention for Refugees of 1951. So in legal terms, we are, as a country, not obligated to deal with refugees. But this is at the beginning. It's more important than any legal obligation. It's more of our duty towards human beings and our brothers and sisters. And in Jordan, you don't call Syrians refugees. We call them our guests. That's something we emphasize.
That's amazing. Charmaine, you are dealing with an influx of Venezuelans in Trinidad and Tobago, upwards of 25,000 in the last few years. How are you dealing with that? You're such a small country.
Yes, the issue with Trinidad and Tobago is that we're a twin island state situated 7 miles off the coast of Venezuela. So with a fast boat, you can get to Trinidad from Venezuela in 20, 30 minutes. So historically, we've had this circular migration of Venezuelans coming to Trinidad and Tobago. Now that we're seeing larger numbers, over the last 2 years, really, we've had quite a significant inflow. And the government does not view Venezuelan nationals as refugees. They view Venezuelans as economic migrants because of the situation in Venezuela. So they are not refugees, they are economic migrants. When recognizing that and the large numbers coming in looking for food, for work, for medication, because that's what they're lacking in Venezuela, government earlier this year granted what they called an amnesty, in that they would allow Venezuelans who were in the country legally or illegally to register with us, and they would be provided with what is called a minister's permit, in that the minister will allow them to remain in Trinidad and Tobago and to work legally. In the 2-week period that we had this registration exercise, we registered 16,523 Venezuelan nationals.
Wow.
And as at today, we've provided about 13,000 with those registration cards, those minister's permits. The thing with the caveat with the registration is that the Immigration Division had to, 1, verify that the person was in fact a Venezuelan, because there were a number of Colombians, there were a number of Cuban nationals who were posing or presenting themselves as Venezuelan nationals. So we had to verify that they're Venezuelan nationals. We also had to verify through Interpol that they had no criminal record. So only if they satisfy those two criteria would they be able to get this work permit and this minister's permit. Together with that, they would have access to only primary and emergency health care. There would be no access to education. And what government was encouraging is that the NGOs and other communities would in some way provide some level of education to the Venezuelans. So that's what we've been doing. And it's, of course, challenging for us. We've never had to deal with such a large influx of any nationality. And we are trying as best as we can, but government has taken the position that they are not refugees.
So that makes it harder
That makes it a
for them
lot
to
harder.
get services. I want to talk about the misconceptions of accepting large numbers of refugees. In Canada, you know, even in Canada, a country as open as this one, there were concerns that Sharia law, for example, might take over certain communities. You know, there was talk of a hotline here briefly. Can you address some of those misconceptions and you know, how do you get over them? How do you answer critics of an open refugee policy? Rebecca, I'll start with you because you probably had to deal with this.
Yes. I mean, there certainly is xenophobia and Islamophobia. In particular, you mentioned, you know, there were concerns about Sharia law and even misconceptions about what Islam is and what Sharia is to start with. So there were some fears broadly. I think, and you know, one thing that I think about from my personal experience is that a lot of people asked me if I was scared of the single man in particular that we were sponsoring. And, you know, if you knew him and you knew his broad smile and his warm heart and his gentle nature, his love for art and animals and babies, you know, you just couldn't even imagine that would be a question. But, you know, for people who hadn't met a particular individual and experienced that person as a human being with a heart and a family and with joys and sadness and so forth, you know, they might get caught up in a sense that something might be threatening. And I think a lot of what our broader community has done effectively is find opportunities for people to meet each other and to get to know each other on a human level. And that can be difficult to scale broadly. But I think it's important to understand, you know, we're not talking about some generalized group of people. And also put out some, you know, very reassuring facts to overcome some of the myths that are associated with newcomers. Yeah.
And you think that's been successful?
I think it's a work in progress. And it's not just about, you know, refugees. Canada has a lot of immigrants and a lot of newcomers. Yeah. And there are, you know, systemic barriers in place, like there are in, I think, all places around the world. The barriers might be different for different people, but you know, there is a devaluing of experience and education and cultural differences that really get in the way of people being able to thrive optimally. And at the same time, you know, there are advances in helping people understand that the fears that they have at base are not playing out in terms of actual threats.
Reem, tell me what you did in Jordan to ensure that you use Sharia law to protect the rights of women and children.
Thank you. Melissa, I want to start that 80% of the population of refugees in the world are in developing countries. Mm-hmm. So you only have 20% that are in the developed countries. And the refugee process with the Geneva Convention, where a refugee who is resettled in a third country is able to gain the nationality of that third country he resides in, only caters to 0.5% of the refugee population worldwide. So we're not talking about large numbers. Putting that aside, any country where you get people coming in, migration, forcibly displaced, or economic even migrants or refugees, there is bound to be disparity between the social norms of any two countries. I mean, Jordan and Syria are considered one natural place, and yet you find that there are differences in social traditions and norms, and one of which was early marriages. In Jordan, any girl under the age of 16 cannot be married unless she gets the approval of the Chief Justice. That age shifts to Syria to 13. And so according to our Jordanian law, which is based on Sharia law, a girl under 16 cannot marry. Her contract is considered null and void. And yet we were faced with cases where there would be 13 and 14-year-old girls who are married. Now, the natural conclusion should be that her marriage should be considered null and void. But with that comes the problems of ensuring her rights and the rights of the child she gets from that marriage when she's married at the age of 13. So we came up with a plan in Jordan where we had a Sharia court inside the refugee camp, and we would ask parents of those Syrian girls to come and register the marriage when the girl is 16, so that we ensure that we protect her rights and the rights of her child. So again, it was an emergency measure where we even overcame our own law in order to protect the best interest of the child and to protect that young mother.
You were also noticing that Jordanian children were getting married at a younger age.
Thank you for reminding me of this, Melissa. Yes, in Jordan we've been working since the 90s to make sure that we decrease the number of early marriages. Because for us, we want the marriage age is 18, so anyone from 16 to 18 is considered an exception. And we were raising the cases where raising awareness so that marriages should not happen before the age of 18. But with the Syrian crisis, we started seeing that there is an increase in early marriages with Jordanians as well, because remember, Syrians are living in hosting communities, and families tend to influence each other. Another issue was the issue of child labor. Again, there was an increase in child labor because of the young Syrians. Many of the Syrians who came into our country, they would consist of like, for example, the grandfather or the uncle with the mother and the children. And usually the male, the husband, is back in Syria fighting or in the opposition or whatever. So we, in many cases, those young Syrian boys were actually working in professions to earn an income. And that also was another burden on the Jordanian government and society, is to face child labor and work on that issue. In terms of education, it was Jordan decided early on that we cannot have those children, Syrian children, out of education, because usually studies say that a refugee would stay in a country for almost 12 years before thinking of returning. And that's if the conflict finishes. It hasn't finished yet in Syria. And so we said we will be having generations of children with no education. So in Jordan, we had to go back to the two-shift school system to ensure that Syrian children are into our schools. Of course, it is much easier than in Turkey because Syrian children who are in Jordan, they speak and study in Arabic, while in Turkey, they had to learn another language in order for them to be in school. So the challenges in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, and in Turkey dealing with the Syrian prices is similar, but there are, of course, best practices or lessons to be learned from each country.
So complex. Tweet?
And I love what you're saying because I think at a high level, what is universally true is the importance of economic integration and inclusion. Because if you have refugees out there, you're not giving them any legal status to work. That really does not help anybody. It doesn't help the host country they're in. It doesn't help them when they're ready to go back to their countries. And I think it's often incumbent. We live in really divisive times right now, especially in the U.S. Those of you here from the U.S. know exactly what I'm talking about. I've never seen it so divisive, and I feel more than ever that it's my responsibility and the responsibility of other refugees to speak up and say, we were one of them 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And now we're thriving because you allowed us an opportunity to economically integrate. And through education, through job skills, through training. And I'll cite one example. In the city of San Jose, California, there were so many Vietnamese who came into that community about 40, 45 years ago, and they couldn't afford high rent, so they went into the worst part of town, East San Jose, downtown San Jose, and started setting up their little sandwich shops, their little restaurants there, because that's all they knew how to do, was how to cook and make food from their homeland. But over time, over just a period of 10 or 15 years, which in the larger continuum of things is not that long if you think about it, within 10 to 15 years, that whole area was completely transformed. It went through a whole economic revitalization, and now it is thriving. There are many other businesses now that aren't just Vietnamese, but really it was the Vietnamese who came in and said, this is a horrible area, it's high crime, but it's all we can afford right now, and they made it better. And there are, I live in Silicon Valley as well, and there are so many of us who have started high-tech companies, and now we're employing other people and paying it forward. So I think it's really important to point out that these are the current problems, this is the short range, but really look at it in the long term and all the economic benefits throughout the world that refugees have been able to accomplish and pay it forward, because perhaps more so than anybody else, we feel that incredible burden, not burden, but the responsibility and obligation every single day to pay it forward, because so many people were so kind to us. And so I think it's just really, I always encourage my refugee friends to speak out. A lot of them have been reluctant to because of all the hostility toward refugees and immigrants in the U.S. right now, but I've been telling them, it's your responsibility to speak out. It really is.
I want to remind everybody that this is a town hall, so if you have any questions for the panelists or any comments, please go to the two mics in the aisles, and we'll get to we can get to questions at the end, or if you have them as we're having this discussion, please feel free to come forward. Charmaine, you are not seeing such an open, you're seeing some of the xenophobia in your country. Can you talk about that?
We're seeing that starting to happen now, and I think if we understand what happens with Trinidad and Venezuela and some of the history, one, there was, apart from the circular migration, you've had the drugs and the guns and everything else coming in between Trinidad and Venezuela. You've also had the women who would come in, and most of the time they would be prostituting. So there is this stigma attached to Venezuelans that the women are prostitutes and the men run drugs and guns. So now when you have 18,000, 20,000 Venezuelans coming in, most people are thinking, but these people are, one, the women are coming to prostitute and to take the men. And yes, you are seeing some of that because you are seeing a lot of mixed marriages, and that's expected. Some of the men are very hardworking, and yes, we've had some who we've prosecuted for drug offenses. But the fear is real that when you have such large numbers coming in, how then do we deal with that? And do we welcome them with open arms? You know, do we try to understand, well, no, they really just want some food and some work. They need to support families back home. And the people that we have interacted with as immigration, yes, those are the persons. They want to work. They want to work legally. They have families back home to support, you know, grandparents who need medication, parents who need medication. But that little bit of xenophobia, the language barrier. We speak English. We are British colony, so all we speak is English, even though we sit 7 miles off the coast of Venezuela. But there are opportunities in there as well that nobody really can see at this point in time. All people are seeing are these large numbers of Venezuelans in the community, dressing differently to them, speaking a different language, maybe a bit abrasive, but it is trying to understand a different culture entirely. And then how do we mix those two cultures together? How do we then understand each other? So there is some of that xenophobia creeping in. For me, I get asked the questions all the time, well, Chief Immigration Officer, what are you doing about all these foreign nationals in the country? You should be deporting them. Why are they here? But from where I sit, I have to take some kind of humanitarian approach while at the same time not running afoul of my own Immigration Act that I'm charged to enforce. You know, so you find yourself sometimes, like I was telling you, between a rock and a hard place in trying to facilitate, but at the same time carry out your functions and then cater to the needs of a population who are demanding that you do something.
Reem, you dealt with this in Jordan.
Yes, one thing that I'd like to stress is that the importance of the state or the government to be actually directing how things are to be handled. And so, I mean, not to give the UNHCR, with all my due respect to them, the upper hand. It's the government, it's the state that should enforce how to deal with bringing in the refugees, registering them. Then they would go to the UN. That's what happened in Jordan. The government, the army, were the ones who were taking in the refugees from the border, taking them to the camp. UNHCR would register them for the resettlement process. But other than that, the security is Jordan's responsibility. Because the people of Jordan needed to feel that the government was in control. Otherwise, if the UNHCR or any UN agency is given a free hand, then people would lose trust in their own government. And I always say when you have the issue of coexistence and overcoming any phobia, you deal with the women and with the youth. Because what we did is that we started having groups of women, Jordanian and Syrian, who would meet together, and they would bring the families closer. While I was in the ministry, I also did a project for integration between the youth, Syrian and Jordanian, so that they would have like entrepreneurship projects with a Syrian and a Jordanian together. And making that integration helps ease any phobia that might develop in the community.
How hard is it to really integrate? Rebecca, I'm going to turn to you here because, you know, we all have heard stories about whether it's Afghans or Syrians who've come to a Western country, and actually the women integrate better because of just the freedoms that they never had back home. Have you noticed that? Have you, with any of your sponsors?
Maybe not that particularly, but I think it is a really big challenge to integrate into a different culture. You know, and I'm thinking back to the very first days that the refugees that I knew best arrived, and one in particular just said, you know, absolutely everything was different. They came in February. Our neighborhood was covered with lots of snow. The house that he stayed in originally with one of the sponsors is made out of wood. It's an old house with creaky wooden floors, and he'd never been in a house like that before, and he thought that the floors were unstable, and so he was scared of that. And we live near a hospital, and he was hearing the helicopter that comes for trauma patients fly over, and instantly thinking of Assad and bombing. And I guess that's a bit of a tangent to your question, really, about the culture. But, I mean, so those basic fundamental things were different, and also expectations about how one behaves and how one interacts, how one gets what they need, how they build relationships, how you negotiate and sort of advocate for yourself for various services. All of those things are just tremendously different. And, you know, even people who have studied cross-cultural effectiveness might sort of intellectually know what to do, but it's very hard to bridge those divides. And we did end up having, you know, or seeing some very interesting breaches of trust that really could be boiled down to just a cross-cultural misunderstanding, different ways of doing things. Direct versus indirect conversation, focus more on task or focus more on relationships. Those are where we saw a lot of really difficult things to navigate. And part of our role as sponsors was to help, you know, help the refugees navigate that. We were also navigating our own cross-cultural misunderstandings at times. But, you know, ultimately, I think, you know, there is a navigation, a way through. And what I see now is that the refugees that I know best are, you know, very much connected to the community, not just to sponsors or people that we introduce them to, but they have their own community with other Canadians, some newcomers and some people who've been around for a long time. You know, they are integrated well, the children are integrated well into school, and the parents have work, and but most of all, they have, you know, sort of overall, largely a sense of well-being in a new community where they do have connections. And that's in the midst of course, ongoing separation with their family, their country, their cultures, in some cases their food, things of comfort, and dealing with ongoing trauma, not just the trauma that they arrived with, but the ongoing trauma of seeing things on social media of, you know, families and friends and special places to them continuing to be, you know, brutalized. So it's a really difficult thing to navigate.
Melissa, I think the issue of why women are easy to integrate than men, it's not because when they come to the West they have more freedom. This is not the case. And the idea of more freedom can be defined in many ways. But women in general are more resilient, and they're able to actually go outside their comfort zone to cater for the needs of their kids. This is a natural instinct. And so in a foreign environment, like in a town in Jordan, the Syrian woman was able to actually reach out to her Jordanian neighbor and start the conversation, or vice versa. So I don't think, you know, the idea of freedoms is the key issue. It never is, because in the Arab culture, the woman is really the center of the family. And, you know, people, she might not be the one giving the commands, but definitely she's the one who is navigating how the ship is sailing.
That's very
That's
true.
a very good point.
I mean, it's just a quick story. Like, you know, like my externally, my dad was always the one in charge of the household, right? But internally, we all knew who was the boss, my mom. And so when my mom made the decision to move from Minnesota to California, much more accessible public universities and colleges here for us. My dad, you know, she went to my dad and said, well, let's move to California. And he said, no, we've only been in the U.S. for, you know, 4 years. We finally saved enough money to buy a house. Why would you want to uproot everybody all over again? She looks at him, she goes, okay, you don't have to go. But the rest of us are going.
I think we have a question.
My name is Nancy Ruth from Toronto. I have two questions. For the woman from Jordan, I had heard that a number of these early childhood marriages were a result of economic necessity, and that the little girls were being sold off to older men for marriage. Was the government of Jordan able to do anything about this and to keep them in schools after these marriages or to discourage this practice? My second question to Canada is our Prime Minister brought in 250,000 Syrian refugees who were not sponsored. And these people, as I understand it, are having a very difficult time. The provinces were not warned of the huge influx in the settlement centers, were not aware of what they were going to have to deal with. Those sponsorships that came in privately, on the whole, they were more educated Syrians than the others, and this has caused a split within the Syrian community. What is your opinion of whether governments should be allowed to bring in refugees that are not sponsored?
I agree with you. At the beginning of the crisis, we did see cases where young Syrian girls were married to older men from neighboring countries. And after a while, when this was detected, and it was detected through the fact that those young girls would go to a clinic because they're pregnant, and then you discover that they are young, they're 13 and 14, but unfortunately, she's already married. So what we needed to intervene to ensure that she gets her rights, because at the end of the day, if a father decides to marry off his daughter without registering the contract of marriage in the court, because it's illegal in all cases, but he goes ahead and does the contract, the only thing the intervention can happen is in the stage of protection. However, there were many campaigns raising awareness, but you have to remember, especially at the beginning of the crisis, the marriage was a mechanism for the whole family to be able to overcome their migration. I'm not justifying this, but this is the reality. So what we try to do is really do awareness campaign, and at the same time stop those marriages from happening, knowing older men would come from neighboring countries to take advantage of those girls. Some of the contracts were not even registered, not even on a piece of paper, and that is where the Sharia court would hold sessions so that they can prove the marriage and so that to give the girl her rights. In Islam, one of the biggest violations for children if they do not have the legitimate lineage. They don't have a known father. So that's a very important right in Islam for children. So our main concern is how to ensure that these children are considered legitimate children and therefore approve the contract of marriage, even if it's by evidence, so that we protect that child and the mother. One of the things I did while I was a minister, because we have 40% of Syrians living in the northern part of Jordan, and we have a national shelter for battered women. So one of the things we did is that we opened another shelter in the northern part of the country, knowing that we would be having more Syrian women, because most of them live there, and to help them in when there is domestic violence cases. So there were interventions. I mean, they're not perfect, but I think we were able to at least get the message across that there is protection for the woman, and that early marriages are not tolerated.
Yes, so you also had a question about Canada, and I'd like to just emphasize that I'm here as a person who sponsored refugees, not as someone who understands all the macro dynamics and public policy related to refugees in Canada. But I have read in the literature, the published peer-reviewed research literature, that in the long run, 3 years and out, that both government-sponsored and privately sponsored refugees fare about the same. And so I do know there is some comparison of notes and some tension between the two groups as they come in over the long haul. If we're thinking about Canada's need to have immigrants, including refugees, to help our country thrive, and if we're thinking about the longer-term outcomes, I think the pairing of government and private sponsorship together allows us to meet more needs of refugees and also more of the needs of Canada.
Question here?
I'm Alison Taunton-Rigby. I'm with the Massachusetts Women's Forum. And first, I want to thank the countries that are running these refugee camps. It's fabulous. I've actually visited Zatri, and it's mind-blowing to visit these refugee camps. And what you're doing in Tobago and Canada, it's fabulous. I'm curious about who's supporting the full costs of these refugee camps, because your countries can't handle this completely. How is it that UN can fund some of it? I know the USAID provides some funding through NGOs. How are the NGOs that are supporting you, and are the ones that we can help as an organization? How can we contribute to supporting these refugees?
Thank you. Jordan has made a plan called the Jordan Resilience Plan. And it's actually to help with the Syrian crisis. Funding through donor countries and agencies had been decreasing and so this year for the JRP we received 16% of the amount allocated for the JRP plan. So I mean, more and more it is becoming the responsibility of Jordan to actually to support those refugees. Although, of course, at the beginning, all the donor countries were ready to help one way or another. And really, I cannot really just talk about donor countries. I think there is also failure from our neighboring countries, who should be the ones actually supporting Jordan in this. It's not, USAID and so on. It's our neighboring countries who are actually not willing to help anymore. So I think, as His Majesty had said, Jordanians have to look inward and depend on themselves.
Melissa, can we just make a point of order? You'll see some Canadians leaving right now. It's not because we're not fascinated about what's going on. We have responsibilities as hostesses, so please forgive us.
They have responsibilities, so please forgive them for leaving.
That's okay.
I know we have more questions. I'm just going to follow up on that. What can we do as members here today to help refugees in our own communities, keeping in mind that not every country has a sponsorship program or an open-door refugee policy?
I think we have to change the definition of refugee. That's on the policy level. Because the definition of a refugee, according to the Geneva Convention in 1951 and the Protocol of 67, talks about a person who flees the country to another country to be settled in a third country. And when we see that almost out of the 60 million of displaced people, only 20 are refugees, the rest are displaced, whether internally or outside, forcibly displaced. So I think the first thing on a policy level is to change the definition of a refugee so that there are new categories of migrants, let's call them, that should be included in the definition. That's what I would think of as a first step on the policy level. And the second thing, I think it's really to understand the human perspective and really to get to know why that person is fleeing that country or is forcibly displaced. Because once you hear the story, your compassion as a human being is different.
Charmaine?
I agree with Reem, because when we talk about the 1951 convention, just think about it. 1951, there's a definition of what a refugee is. The world has changed, and things have changed, and there are new migrants and new situations presenting itself to us. You know, and as the situation with the Venezuelans, are they refugees or not? Do they fall into that category? Are they being politically persecuted, etc., those 5 grounds outlined in the convention? So clearly there is need for a new definition of a refugee, or even break down what are migrants and a broader definition or different definitions of migrants. But apart from that, and for countries like Trinidad and Tobago, where we are now grappling with this situation, it calls for people to learn more and to understand what is happening around them, what is happening in the world around them, and why they are coming to this country. Are they coming to stay? Are they coming to take something and they're not? Are they coming to contribute? How can they contribute? So it comes with persons and the citizens educating themselves. And yes, government has a role to play in educating, but the government themselves have to be educated. And I think that's part of the challenge, because politicians are the ones who set out policy, and they are the ones who make the law, and therefore they too need to be educated. And I think that's where we need to go.
Yeah. Rebecca?
So I'm representing sort of more of the micro personal perspective, so I'll stick to that, even though I recognize the need for the systemic changes as well. But there's very simple, small things that anybody can do. If there are refugees in your community, you can reach out and make a connection, help them learn the local language just by having a conversation, invite them into your home or, into a cafe to just make a connection. And in particular, to make connections so that you and others can see human beings, not just something that's needy or something that's vulnerable, but full human beings, and make those connections and be helpful in small ways.
And I'll continue on that micro thought and then bring it back to the macro. So on a micro level, for refugees who are already in the country, there are, I know that in the U.S. there's a wonderful group called Upwardly Global. They're based in New York, but they have chapters in Chicago and in San Francisco, where they find jobs for refugees with degrees and professional high school degrees and professional work experience in their country, so that starting over doesn't mean that they have to start at the bottom of the economic ladder and the bottom of the job chain and clean homes. Not that that can't be an honorable profession, because I know many people who have been through that situation, but so that they can get meaningful work to support their families. So Upwardly Global partners with many, many companies across the U.S. to bring these refugees into those companies where they can have decent paying jobs and start rebuilding their lives again in a purposeful, meaningful manner. So if you want to volunteer or if you want to donate funds to Upwardly Global, upwardlyglobal.org. I know that they're always looking for assistance. So that's on the macro level, what we can do, and the micro level rather. And the macro level, I would really agree with what Charmaine and Reem have said, which is, as a refugee myself, it's not really a political debate. I came here when I was so little, when I was 8 years old. To me, I knew nothing about politics at that time. It wasn't a political debate. It wasn't an economic debate. For me, it was just a human debate. Mm-hmm. How do we treat these human beings? They're not here. No one gets on a boat on the South China Sea because they want to come here and steal a job. That is not why we get on a boat. Right? We get on a boat because we fear for our lives. We're fleeing persecution, and we want to go somewhere where we can make a difference and rebuild again. And I think if we can, as much as we can, reframe the conversation from that advantage point, I think it would help move the conversation along. And I always, try to point out to people that, despite the image out there of refugees being here to commit crimes, steal jobs, the reality is that nearly half of all refugees around the world today are women or girls. And so if we don't find a way to help refugees rebuild their lives, we're really putting millions of women and girls at high risk for generations to come. And so that's my other point.
Okay, I'm being told to wrap up, but
if I may add, you asked what can we do, is really support UNHCR. UNHCR last year got 51% of the funding required. And UNHCR, so they got 190 million globally from the 300 million that is their budget. And UNHCR do provide families of refugees with direct financial assistance. 78% of refugees in Jordan are below the poverty line. So what can we do is actually support the UNHCR to help those people who are fleeing their countries.
okay, thank you. I'm sorry, I know there are questions out there, but can I take 2 more questions? All right.
Thank you. I'm Dina Diorio from North Carolina, and one of the big issues in the United States is pathways to citizenship. And I'm interested to know, have your countries really thought about over the long term, as people are resettled in your countries for long periods of time, pathways to citizenship and the impact of not having a pathway to citizenship, which is what we're really seeing in the United States?
This is to me.
This is to all of you, I think.
Okay. Well, the experience in Jordan is that citizenship was given to the Palestinian refugees. So 92% of Palestinians living in Jordan who are considered refugees according to the UN and the UNRWA, they have the Jordanian nationality. Syrians, they have the nationality, so they do not have a problem with that. They get the residency and they get the work permit and the education, but they still keep their nationality.
Last question.
Okay, it's on now. Hi, so I'm actually a former refugee from Vietnam myself, and I echo what Thuy said about feeling an obligation to pay it forward and make a positive impact on the world. With all that I do with my life, I'll be speaking on Friday about my work. Now, my question is, it seems to me the refugee crisis is very much entangled with the rise of right-wing nationalism across the world. What strategies have you had to address the rise of right-wing nationalism, xenophobia, and just the change in dynamics as people try to protect resources instead of sharing them?
Boy, that's a big question. Anybody? Thuy?
That's kind of beyond my scope. You know, that's a really tough one. I don't even know where to begin on that. You know, I think the most you can do is continue telling these stories and hope for public education and public awareness, because that's what it comes down to. You know, in the U.S. now, we are seeing the rise of white nationalism, and we've seen so many terrible incidents. But if I had to say there was one silver lining from that, is that it really has really galvanized people to act. I have, just within my own personal circle, so many friends who have never been politically active in their lives are now politically active because they have decided this is not right. We're not taking it. It's time to rise up. And so I think as individuals, that's what we can do. There's so many groups out there now that are trying to get together and do something about this through public awareness, through education, through political involvement, through putting forth candidates for office who have a real shot at winning and trying to turn this ugly tide around. And I think we can all play a role in that. I'm not a policymaker. I'm not a government elected official, so I can't really speak to that. I can only speak to what I see myself doing and friends and other colleagues doing, in that it has really given us a new purpose, I think. I think the purpose has always been there, but I think this has really made it bloom and blossom and given it urgency, the kind of urgency that we haven't ever seen before.
Okay, and I'm sorry, I'm being told to... Can I take one more question?
Well, I am from Turkey. My name is Ifet. And we have the largest Syrian refugees population in the world. and there are 4 million refugees, and 3,600,000 are from Syria. And 1 million of the Syrian refugees are aged between 15 to 24, and 65% of them male refugees. And through the births and the new arrivals, that number goes up 1,000 per day. And Turkey has spent so far $46 billion for the refugees. In our culture, the word refugee is very humiliating, and because they are our sisters and the brothers, they are our neighbors. And so the country now, we need the international financial assistance urgently, and to sort out the crisis, this global crisis, with the compassion. And so there are effective projects going on with the local municipalities and the civil groups. And so anybody who would like to make contribution to this crisis, they can approach to these centers in Turkey. So
Great.
I just wanted to edit these some fact sheets.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, Reem, Charmaine, Rebecca, and Twee. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you.